So my name's Associate Professor Halim Rane. I'm from Griffith University. I've been involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict for quite a number of years. In fact, I wrote my PhD thesis on the Israel-Palestine conflict. I went to Israel and Palestine to do my field research. And since that time, I've written 2 books and 5 journal articles, and I've delivered, countless presentations at conferences on the Israel-Palestine conflict all around the world, including over in the United States. So I'm here today to give you a bit of information about this issue. Nora, if you go to the next slide, please. Yep. So today, what I'd like to cover is the origins and the history of the conflict, the failure of the peace process, a little bit about international law and what it means to have a just peace. I'll also talk briefly about the state of Palestine, which has been recently recognised by the United Nations and effectively the international community, and Google, of course, which makes it, very significant. And I'll also be talking a little bit about campaigning and activism, which I think is an important issue right now. And this is a time where people are looking at, what can I do in respect to this issue? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. To begin with, here's a map of the part of the world that we're talking about here. I think most of you would be familiar with the land of Palestine, but essentially we're talking about this territory that is east of the Jordan River that you can see here. It's north of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and south of Lebanon and Syria, and basically sits to the west of the Mediterranean Sea. This land we have historically referred to as Palestine, and when I say we, I'm talking about human beings in general. This is not a term just used by Arabs and Muslims. In fact, this term was used by Jewish people, for centuries as well. So this is a term that's been commonly used by people around the world in reference to this part of the world. What I'm going to be doing today is talking about a number of myths and facts, and I think that the problem a lot of people have in understanding this issue is that it's clouded by a lot of myths. And so what I'd like to do is address a number of those myths and present to you the facts from historical and legal perspectives. The first one relates to the idea that, there's 2 myths here. One is that this land historically belongs to the Jewish people, and that the conflict between the Arabs and Muslims has been going on for millennia, or the Arabs and the Jews and the Arabs has been going on for millennia. Both of these points are incorrect. Let's look at the land of Palestine from a historical perspective. First of all, the ancient inhabitants of the land of Palestine are referred to as the Canaanites, and we can find references to these people in the Bible. The other term that's commonly used is Semites. We're talking about Semitic people. A Semite doesn't refer to a particular ethnic group. A Semite refers to a particular language group. And within that particular language group, we find people who speak Assyrian, Aramaic, Arabic, Babylonian, Hebrew, Phoenician, and a number of other languages. So when we speak about anti-Semitism, it's commonly used as in reference to racism against Jewish people, but in fact a whole range of other people, including Arab people themselves, are Semites. If we look at the land of Palestine, we can see there wasn't just one group of people who historically inhabited Palestine. In fact, we have the Philistines living in the area of what is around Gaza today, the Jebusites living around Jerusalem, the Hebrews living in what is today Hebron and Nablus, the Nabateans living in the Negev, the desert region towards the south, and the Phoenicians living towards the north in the Galilee. So a range of different people have historically inhabited Palestine. It hasn't just been inhabited by people who we refer to as Arabs today, nor has it been inhabited by people that we referred to as Hebrews or Jewish people. Range of different people have lived here. And if you think about this land, it's at the crossroads of civilization. What does that mean? Effectively, people came through there as traders. Traders also came with ideas from their lands. And these ideas included ideas about religion. So at some point in history, before monotheism, this was a land where people engaged in polytheism, or the worship of idols. Judaism comes in as one of the first monotheistic religions. And a bunch of people in this land embrace Judaism. Christianity comes through sometime later, and a bunch of those people embrace Christianity. Islam comes through in the 7th century, and a bunch of those people embrace Islam, so much so that about 80% of the population at the time of the emergence of the conflict are Muslims. About just slightly less than 20% of the population were Christians, and only 2 or 3% of that population remain Jewish. So the point here is that people who today are Muslims in Palestine, their ancestors were historically Christians, or perhaps if you go back further, Jewish. So this is a land where different ideas have filtered through. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The other very important point here is that Palestine has historically been ruled by many different groups of people. The myth is that this is the land of the Jewish people. It's historically been inhabited by them and has historically been ruled by them. History denies this point. If we look through history, we can see there's been a range of different rulers in the land of Palestine. Take the Egyptians, for example. They ruled Palestine for a total of 1,150 years, from 2500 to 1700 BC, and again from 1550 to 1200 BC. The Hysox ruled for 160 years, the Hittites ruled for 60 years, the Philistines ruled for 539 years, and then we had the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Armenians, all ruling for different periods of time as well. Now, much is said about the kingdom of David and Solomon, but an important point here is that there are no historical or archaeological records to even prove the existence of a kingdom of David or kingdom of Solomon. That's an important point to note. Some of you may be aware that there's extensive archaeological research going on in Israel right now, trying to find proof of the existence of the kingdom of Solomon, because this is an important part of their claim to the Temple Mount, or the Haram al-Sharif, as the Arabs would refer to it as, and the Muslims. So the only references we really have are the Bible and the Quran for the existence of the kingdom of David and Solomon. And collectively, this kingdom, the kingdom of David and Solomon, lasted for 73 years, from 1000 to 927 BC. That's it. 73 years. At the fall of the kingdom of Solomon, we have the kingdom of Judah lasting for 341 years, and the kingdom of Israel lasting for 205 years. But these kingdoms were not comprehensive in terms of the land or the territory of Palestine. The kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel essentially were in what we call today the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, as the Israeli people will refer to it as. So very short periods of time for Jewish rule. Far less so than even the Egyptians, less so than even the Philistines. Moving forward, we have the Romans ruling for 677 years, and this is now corresponding with the time of Jesus. Then after the fall of the Romans, well, they were defeated by the Persians. The Persians came back in for 14 years. Then the Byzantine defeated them, or the Eastern Roman Empire defeated the Persians, and they ruled for another 10 years. And then we come to the period in 638. This is the period of Arab Muslim rule. Essentially, the rule by the Muslims, first by the Arabs, then by the Turks in the form of the Ottoman Empire, lasted for almost 1,200 years, making Muslim rulers the longest rulers of the land of Palestine from a historical perspective. I'm not quoting for you the Quran or any other religious text here. I'm just telling you what history has to say. The only interruption we have in Muslim rule is the period of the Crusaders. The Crusaders from Europe, followers of the Catholic faith, ruled for 103 years, ruling from 1099 until 1187, when Salahuddin Ayyubi, or Saladin as he's known in the West, retook Palestine and specifically Jerusalem. The Crusaders came back for another short stint between 1229 and 1244. But essentially, we have a period of about 1,200 years of continuous Muslim rule, only interrupted by about a century by rule of the Crusaders. And we're talking about comprehensive rule of the whole of the land of Palestine, including the holy city of Jerusalem. So that's an important point to note. So when someone makes this claim that this is the land of the Jewish people, they've been the historical inhabitants, the historical rulers, that's not true. Historically, yes, Jewish people have resided in this land, not comprehensively, and they have not ruled comprehensively in this land. Their rule has been short and confined to particular parts of the Palestinian territory. By the time we come to the modern period, which is where the Israel-Palestine conflict begins, because of course it's important to note that the Israel-Palestine conflict is not an ancient conflict between Jewish people and Arab people, or between Jewish people and Muslims. This is a conflict that has very modern origins, and we can pinpoint the origins of this conflict to the period of World War I. To be a little bit more specific, what we have to understand is that the Jewish people were persecuted throughout Europe for many centuries, which led at the end of the 19th century to the development of a movement called the World Zionist Organization. The objective of the World Zionist Organization was to find a homeland for Jewish people outside of Europe. The founder of this organization, Theodor Herzl, had the objective of finding a piece of land outside of Europe so that the Jewish people could be recognized as Europeans, because his argument was that while we're in Europe, we're always going to be seen as different and as outsiders. No matter how much we try to assimilate, we'll never be accepted as Europeans. We'll only be seen as Europeans when we move outside. So he spoke to a number of the ruling powers of the day, spoke to the Ottomans, spoke to the Germans, spoke to the British, trying to find a homeland for the Jewish people. And he was secular. He didn't mind where this land was going to be, and there was discussions about, some part of Uganda, some part of Argentina, even a part of northwestern Australia was discussed at one point. But it was on the insistence of the Russian Jewish people, who were a lot more religiously oriented, that this homeland for the Jewish people that he was seeking should be in Palestine. Now, an important document was signed in 1917. This was between Chaim Weizmann, who at that time was the president of the World Zionist Organization, and the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour. The document is famously titled the Balfour Declaration. Essentially, Britain resided to establishing a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And there are a couple of other clauses to that document which says that nothing would be done to negatively impact on the native population, etc., etc. Of course, those parts of it have been ignored, as we're all acutely aware of. But essentially what happened was Britain signed this agreement with the World Zionist Organization before it even had control of Palestine. At this time, and for decades preceding, Palestine was under the rule of the Ottomans, the Turkish Muslim Empire. The Ottomans were defeated by the British, however, in 1918, a year later, and it was from this time that Britain came into control of the land of Palestine. And from 1922 until 1948, essentially, Palestine was under a British mandate. Just as a point of historical record, there was a forerunner to the United Nations called the League of Nations. And this international organisation essentially gave Britain a mandate to rule over different parts of the world, including the Arab world. And one of the mandates Britain was given was over Palestine. And so essentially, from the end of World War I all the way up until 1948, Palestine was under the rule of the British. Now, as soon as the British came into control, the World Zionist Organization came to them and said, here, Balfour Declaration, remember that one? You need to come good on this promise. And so what Britain had to do then was facilitate the migration of Jewish people from Europe to Palestine. This took place over a number of decades, and this is where we see the origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Those Jewish people from Europe also came with the support of a number of Jewish organisations like the Jewish National Fund and the Jewish Agency. Essentially, what their role was to purchase land within Palestine, displace the native Palestinian population, and place the migrating Jews from Europe onto this land. And this is where the Palestine conflict originates from. There were a number of British commissions that took place during this time in the 1920s and in 1930, the Hope Simpson Commission, the Shaw Commission, etc. and they all found that the reasons why there is conflict emerging between the Arab population and the Jewish population in Palestine is because of this displacement of people from their land and a denial of a livelihood. Essentially, by 1948, the State of Israel was declared. Another very important milestone occurred, though, in the previous year. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but that was when the United Nations intervened and the resolution, UN General Assembly Resolution 181 was recommended. And this resulted in an outbreak of conflict in the territory, which resulted in Israel capturing about 78% of historical Palestine and declaring its state over that 78% of the land. So on the 14th of May 1948, this is when the State of Israel was declared. But in 1947, Britain basically washed its hands of the United Nations, of Palestine, and handed it over to the newly formed United Nations. Now, just as a bit of background, the territory of Palestine is about 27 million dunhams. Dunhams is a unit of measure used by the Ottomans. It roughly equates to about 27 million square kilometres. The population of Palestine in 1946 was just short of 2 million. 69% were Palestinians, Muslim and Christian Palestinians, and 31% were Jews. Now, most of those Jews were recent migrants. Only about 2 or 3% of historical Palestine was Jewish. So that 31% is represented mainly by the migrants who had come from Europe, not from the indigenous Jewish Palestinians. Okay? So this is an important point to remember. When we think about historical Palestine, there's 3 main religious groups that comprised that population. The majority were the Palestinian Muslims, about 80%. Just less than 20% were the Palestinian Christians, and then around 2 or 3% were the Palestinian Jews. Okay? That's important to remember. The Jews we're talking about here, though, most of those are coming from Europe. They're European Jews, who are different to the Middle Eastern Jewish people, and they even have a different name for them. The Middle Eastern Jewish people are referred to as the Sephardic Jews, and they look different. They look quite similar to Arab people. Whereas the ones who are coming from Europe are the Ashkenazi Jews, and they look distinct from the Middle Eastern Jews. Another important point to note is that the Palestinians, the Muslims, Christians, and that small percentage of Jewish people, had inhabited the land of Palestine for millennia. 93% of the Jews migrated within the preceding 30 years. There's another very important point about land ownership here. I mentioned that the Jewish Agency came in and was purchasing land and displacing the native Palestinian population. In spite of all of those efforts, the Palestinians still legally owned 93% of the land. The Jewish people legally owned, I've got here 7%, but the actual precise figure is 6.6%. So at the time that the United Nations decided to partition Palestine in 1947 and form a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, the Palestinians owned 93% of the land. The Jews only owned 6.6% of the land. The Palestinians were 70% of the population, and the Jewish people were only 30% of the population. And in addition to that, the Palestinian people had lived there for millennia. The overwhelming majority of the Jewish people at that time were recent migrants, had only come within the last 30 years. This is what the United Nations decided. If you look at the first map here, you can see what the recommendation was under UN Resolution 181. This is the petition resolution of Palestine that was passed in 1947. It basically awards about 55% of historical Palestine to the Jewish population and about 43% to the Palestinians, and the other little pink part you can see there is Jerusalem, which was supposed to be an independent state under the trusteeship of the United Nations. Now, clearly this is not a fair, a moral, a just decision. based on those statistics I mentioned earlier. The Palestinians are 70% of the population, they've lived there for millennia, they own 93% of the land, yet they're being given less than half of the territory under this resolution. So it should come as no surprise that the Palestinian people rejected, and the Arab League rejected this resolution. It should also come as no surprise that the Jewish people accepted this resolution and embraced it. They were 30% of the population. Most of them are recent migrants, and they only legally owned 6.6% of the land, yet they were getting 53% of the territory. So what happened was, as soon as the Palestinians declared, we don't accept Resolution 181, it's not fair, it's not just, it's not acceptable, the Jewish military and paramilitary forces that had been in training for some years prior, and here's a point to note, why did the British leave Palestine? The British left Palestine because of what is referred to by historical records. This is not from Palestinian records, this is from independent sources. Historians who have studied the Palestine issue refer to it as Zionist terrorism. What did the Zionist terrorists do? The Haganah, the Irgun, and other military Jewish forces. What they did was they assassinated British officers, they did sabotage, they did bombings. It culminated in 1946 with the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The King David Hotel is significant because this was the British headquarters in Palestine. 91 people were killed in that bombing. And it was at this point that the British said, we've had enough of Palestine, we're going to leave and we're going to hand this problem over to the United Nations. And so the British were out, and the Jewish people were essentially in charge of their own destiny here in this land. And as soon as the Palestinians in 1947 said, we don't accept Resolution 181, and as they should have said, because it was completely unacceptable, the Jewish military and paramilitary forces, who were already well trained and had proven their abilities against the British Empire, set about conquering not only the 55% allocated to their state, but an additional 23%. So this is why now you can see in the first map, the blue represents the Jewish state, but the blue and purple represents the Jewish state. So this is the blue is the land they were allocated by Resolution 181, and the purple is the additional land they conquered in this first, what is referred to as the first Arab-Israeli war. But there's a point to be made about the term war in reference to this period of history or this event. I'll come to that in a moment, but first I'd just like to reiterate a couple of points about Resolution 181. The Jewish state was getting 55%. In that 55%, the Jews legally owned only 11% of the land. Jews would have a population of just short of 500,000, but almost as many Palestinians were going to be in that state. The Palestinian state was going to be 43% of the land, only 1% of that was Jewish owned. The Palestinian population was going to be over 800,000, less than 10,000 Jews. Jerusalem would be an international city. Now, on the surface, that is unfair. But if you look more closely at the details, you can see just how unfair and problematic this resolution was. And that is, if you look at the kind of land that was being allocated to the Jewish state, you can see that the citrus growing areas, the cereal growing areas, and keeping in mind citrus was the major export of Palestine prior to World War II. These were all going to be in the Jewish state. The source of electricity, the only airport, the port at Haifa, all of this, the airport at Lydda and the port at Haifa, all were going to be as part of the Jewish state. So the Palestinians were going to get the parts of the country with the least agricultural prospects and the least infrastructural prospects as well. Now, a number of Israeli historians have written about, not just Israeli, but other historians, but I'm referring here just to Israeli sources, just so there's no accusation here of bias or, you know, he's only talking about Palestinians or, you know, something like that. I'm using Israeli sources here. In the 1970s, under the Freedom of Information Act, the Israeli government released to academics the archives, the military archives of the State of Israel. And a number of Israeli historians began to study what happened at those years of the creation of the State of Israel, which occurred basically between 1947 to 1948. And one of those scholars by the name of Ilan Pappé wrote a very important book that was published in 2007 called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, a very provocative title. He wasn't the only one to write about this. Others, like Oxford University professor Avi Shlaim, also wrote about this particular period of history in a book called The Iron Wall. So I recommend you check out those sources, but I'm quoting here from Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, because he importantly clarifies this very significant period of history that is often regarded as, the catalyst for the Israel-Palestine conflict and the broader Arab-Israeli conflict, and gives an explanation for the Palestinian refugees. So it's very important to take note of what Ilan Pappé has said here. He says that, he talks about the period between November 1947. November is significant because this is when the UN resolution was passed, and this is when the Jewish military and paramilitary set about their ethnic cleansing campaign. So he's talking about this period between November 1947 and 1949. And he says this: when it created its nation state, the Zionist movement did not wage a war that tragically but inevitably led to the expulsion of parts of the indigenous population, but the other way around. The main goal was the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which the movement coveted for its new state. He goes on to say, by 1948, when the Arab armies entered Palestine, 250,000 Palestinians had already been expelled, 200 villages destroyed, and scores of towns emptied. Now, this is very significant because the historical myth, if you go to, for example, the Israeli Foreign Affairs website and look at the history of the conflict, the myth that is propagated is that the Arab states declared war on Israel. Israel was trying to defend itself, so that idea starts, very early on. Israel is defending itself against the Arab countries, and tragically but inevitably, many of the Palestinians were displaced from the land, and Israel came into possession of 78% of historical Palestine. So it's because of the Arab invasion that all of this occurred. That's the myth. What Ilan Pappé is saying is the reason why it's a myth, the reason why 1948 is a phony war, is because the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians began before any Arab armies entered. It's a historical fact that after the 15th of May 1948, the Arab armies did enter and fight against the Israeli forces. But what Ilan Pappé is saying is that from November 1947, 6 months earlier, this is when the Jewish military and paramilitary forces began the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So as he puts it, 250,000 Palestinians had already been expelled, 200 villages already destroyed, and scores of towns already emptied before any of the Arab armies entered Palestine. So he calls this a phony war. The war of 1948, he calls it a phony war, and he's not alone. People like Avi Shlaim, even Benny Morris, other Israeli historians also make this point. But Ilan Pappé says, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had been expelled by force before the war began, and tens of thousands more would be expelled in the first weeks of the war. For most Palestinians, the date of 15 May 1948, when the State of Israel was declared, was of no special significance at the time. It was just one more day in the horrific calendar of ethnic cleansing that had started more than 5 months earlier. Now, that's a point of history that everybody needs to understand if they're to understand the Israel-Palestine conflict. What were the consequences of this? Basically, 800,000 Palestinians were made refugees. This was half the Palestinian population at the time. Can you imagine a country where half the population is just completely, is killed or expelled from their own land? Well, we can. We're seeing it today in places like Syria, for example. So you understand the magnitude of this. In the land that became the State of Israel, over 80% of the Palestinian population was either killed or removed. Over 530 Palestinian villages were completely destroyed. And when I say destroyed, I mean razed to the ground. If you go there today, you don't even see remnants of these Palestinian villages. A lot is made of, the environmental credentials of Israel, building these forests and trees and all of this kind of thing, planting trees and building forests. Where are they doing that? In the place where those villages used to exist, in order to erase the memory of those Palestinian villages. But we have maps. The Palestinians have good historical records and they know where those villages were. So there's no denying any of this. And even Israeli historians are supporting that point about 500 villages, over 500 villages being destroyed. 11 towns were completely emptied of their Palestinian inhabitants. These were towns where, you know, there was mixed populations between Jewish and Palestinian people, because it's important to remember that there was no conflict between Jews and Arabs prior to this time of, you know, the 1920s, basically. Prior to this time, Arabs and Jewish people lived as neighbours. You can read stories where they would look after each other's children. They lived in the same neighbourhoods. So when we're talking about the emptying of these towns, we're talking about them going into towns where there was mixed populations and just wiping out the Palestinians in those towns. Over 30 massacres took place. Among the first of them was the one that occurred in the village Dir Yassin, which served as a catalyst for further massacres that took place, over 30 of them, according to Israeli historical records. And this is corroborated by research that has been conducted by British historians. The book of David Hirst, The Gun and the Olive Branch, is an excellent one to read, as well as Palestinian scholars like Rashid Khalidi, who has written about this period of history as well. Yeah, so you can look at, I've got a reference list at the end, but David Hirst, the Gun and the Olive Branch, and Rashid Khalidi, who has written quite extensively journal articles as well as books. Now we come to, sorry, I should pause here for a moment and ask, are there any questions? We've covered a fair bit already, so are there any questions I can answer up to this point for you? Yes?
I have one about the maps, because I've never seen it before, and you know, your point about the different territory, but it just occurred to me, like, why, did they give any rationale other than the fertile areas, why they didn't just sort of draw a line and split them in half, for example, so they had equal port and, you know, all the rest of it?
Yeah.
Is it because of the desert? Because of the
well, that was going to be in the Jewish state, the desert. Yeah. So, look, there's no, people have pored over this, and there's no logical reason why it should be divided in this way. And in fact, when the map was first presented, it was said, it looks like two serpents intertwined in conflict. It doesn't look like this is going to ever be a solution. It looks like you're going to make more of a conflict out of this by structuring the division in this way. So it was criticised right from the beginning by, you know, independent observers. Yeah, so there's no rhyme or reason, but it does seem as though if we look at the committee that was established, there was a small group of about 11 countries were on a committee to look at the issue of the partition of Palestine, and they originally rejected it. But it was on the insistence of the United States that changed the vote of some of those nations with the threat of withdrawing aid from those nations, that they changed the way they voted and they supported the partition of Palestine. And that is a consequence of lobbying from Jewish communities in the United States. And so, given that background, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the better areas, the parts of the country with the better infrastructure, would be part of that Jewish state. Yep. Right, so we're now, any other questions up to this point? Yep.
Just wondering, you know, when you talk about that time, 1947, 1948, and the Israeli, was it Israeli army?
Right. So we can't say, before 1948, we can't say Israeli army because the state of Israel was only declared in May 1948, so that it officially became Israeli army. But what we had prior to this was Jewish military and paramilitary forces. So we have people who migrated to Israel who were from Europe or Canada or other parts of the Western world, who were part of those militaries, who brought those skills with them. And basically from the 1940s, the Jews in Palestine were engaged in training. They were training their population so that they could be ready for battle. There was a major Palestinian revolt that occurred between 1935 and 1939, and this was suppressed by the British. They brought in an additional 100,000 troops to basically wipe out any potential the Palestinians had to form their own independent country and push out the British. Because remember, this is a time of anti-colonialism, and a lot of the world, including the Muslim world, were fighting for independence against their colonial rulers. So the Palestinians were also engaged in this. So after the Palestinians were diminished of any capabilities of forming their own state, military and otherwise, this is when the Jewish population saw their best chance, because now the Palestinians are neutralised, and now we only have to focus on the British, and they were successful through sabotage, assassinations, bombings, etc., in driving out the British. Yeah. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
All right, thank you. So the peace process, thank you. So now we come, was there another question though? Someone else had their hand up? Okay, so we'll talk about the peace process. Straight up, I don't believe that there is ever going to be a two-state solution, certainly not one that's fair and just and viable for the Palestinian people. There may at some point be something that's forced upon them, but I don't believe this could possibly be fair, just, or viable. So if you are engaging with politicians or other people and they talk about, oh, well, I believe in a two-state solution, question them. What exactly does that mean? Show them a map and tell us where would this Palestinian state be within this territory today, given the so-called facts on the ground. So the point I'm trying to get at here is the peace process has been an utter and a complete failure. The peace process has been a failure because of two reasons. One, because it insists on negotiations between two highly asymmetrical parties. And there's a complete absence of reference to international law. Okay, so where did the whole peace process begin? Keeping in mind, the Israel-Palestine conflict commences in the 1920s. 1947, we have the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. We have, the Palestinian refugee problem emerging. In 1967, we have Israel further attacking the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and Jerusalem, and so they captured the Gaza Strip from Egypt, they captured the West Bank from Jordan, they captured the Golan Heights from Syria, they captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and they capture Jerusalem as well. So basically, from 1967, 100% of historical Palestine is now under Jewish rule. Do we have a peace process beginning yet? Not yet. Not until 1991 do we see the first peace process begin. And this was the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. What's significant about that year? Why 1991 of all years? We're talking decades after the conflict's begun. I know you know the answer. Anybody else? What also happened in 1991? Big event in the Middle East. Oh, come on, lucky there's not an exam. Lucky there's not an exam. The Gulf War. First Gulf War. So Iraq invaded Kuwait. UN Security Council resolution was passed authorising a coalition of nations to remove Iraq from Kuwait, including by the use of force. And so what America needed at this time was the support and the assistance of the neighbouring Arab nations to be able to pursue this goal of driving Iraq out of Kuwait. Now, so when they go to the Arab nations and they said, we've got a problem in the Middle East, Iraq has invaded Kuwait, and their response was, really? An occupation? Well, we know about another occupation that's been going on for quite some time as well. What are you going to do about the Israel-Palestine conflict? Oh, yes, we're going to have a Madrid Peace Conference. Going to resolve that one. Now, the Madrid Peace Conference was farcical. The Palestinians were not independently represented, but they were part of the Jordanian representation. There was this idea of swapping land for peace. So people, have to give up their basic rights in order to have a resolution of this conflict. It was fundamentally flawed. So that didn't lead to any, I'm not telling you anything new, you didn't need to come here today to know that, didn't lead to peace. Then we have the Oslo Accords. Now the Oslo Accords are very important because this was seen as a breakthrough, and this was seen as, now we're going to have a peaceful resolution between Israelis and Palestinians, and both Israelis and Palestinians were quite optimistic about this in the beginning. But let's have a look at the lead up to this. What was the very significant event that was happening in the Palestinian territories prior to this time? Now, I see some Palestinians in the room, and if they don't know this one, it's going to be very embarrassing for you. 1987. Absolutely, the first Intifada. What did this mean? This was young Palestinians who had been under occupation. If you take 1947 from that time, 1967 from that time, so at least 20 to 40 years they had been under an illegal military occupation. Now, why I say illegal is because that's what the United Nations Security Council called it. So they'd been under this illegal military occupation for decades, and this young Palestinian population had had enough. And so they were resisting. This was a non-violent resistance, by the way. They were resisting the Israeli military rule, which was brutal, which was unjust, which was illegal. And they would engage in refusal to pay taxes. There were restrictions put on them, like they couldn't wear Palestinian colours, they couldn't fly a Palestinian flag, so they would do this in protest. They would go out in the streets and march, and then they would be confronted by the Israeli military, including tanks, and they would throw stones at those tanks, which became, the symbol of the Palestinian resistance all over the world. What was happening at this time is that Israel was looking really bad. Its defence minister, Yitzhak Rabin, had a policy of break their bones. Can you imagine? How barbaric, how uncivilised. But breaking the bones of Palestinian children was the policy at the time. And there was footage seen by Western governments, seen by people in the West, of Israeli soldiers taking young Palestinians who had been throwing stones and literally holding out their arm, taking a boulder and breaking their bones. And so when people in the State Department in the United States saw this, they said, Israel, really? They look like more one of these other barbaric regimes rather than, a liberal Western democracy. How do we kind of relate to this? And this is coming on the back of what Israel had done in Lebanon. The capstone of all of that was the massacre in the refugee camps, the Palestinian refugee camps in Shabra and Shatila. But, a whole range of human rights violations and war crimes were committed by Israel in Lebanon prior to this. And so now you have a situation where Israel is violating the basic rights and the world is seeing it on their television screens. And so the Israelis had a problem. They wanted the Palestinian Intifada to end. Unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership of, the Fatah leadership, Yasser Arafat and his close colleagues, were outside of the Palestinian arena at the time, and they wanted back in. So they were secretly meeting with the Israelis in Oslo prior to the signing of this. This 1993 reflects when the Oslo Accords were signed on the White House lawn. But in the years prior to this, Yasser Arafat and his close colleagues in Fatah, as well as the Israelis, were meeting in secret because they both had something to gain from an end to the Intifada. The Israelis wanted it to end because they were looking bad and they were afraid that the Palestinian resistance would overwhelm them, and then they would have to make some concessions in terms of giving Palestinian land back, perhaps drawing down the occupation, etc. And the Palestinians, who were the Fatah movement, wanted to get back into the game. They wanted to be the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. And essentially, that's all that was agreed to at Oslo. The Intifada ended, and Yasser Arafat's Fatah movement became what became the PLO, the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. But did this end the conflict? No. Why? It said nothing about the occupation. It didn't bring an end to the occupation. It didn't make an improvement in the rights of the Palestinian people. It didn't withdraw the military. It didn't give them back their land. And in fact, the situation got worse for Palestinians on the ground after the signing of the Oslo Accords. The settlements, the building of Israeli settlements, increased by 60% after the signing of the Oslo Accords. It was at this time that all the checkpoints, anyone who's been there knows them very well, all the checkpoints started to emerge in the West Bank, as well as in Gaza at that time. And so Palestinians, unable to move from town to town, from place to place, without going through multiple Israeli checkpoints, making life impossible. Impossible to go to school, impossible to go to work, impossible to see your friends and relatives. Just making life hell. Supporting that objective of the Israelis so the Palestinians would voluntarily transfer or leave Palestine. So this all occurs under the Oslo Accords. So after a number of years of this, the Palestinians quickly realise this is not a plan for peace. This is only further entrenchment of the occupation. We have Camp David, the Camp David meeting between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. And at this time, it was, this was to discuss the final status issues. The final status issues supposedly include refugees, although that was off the table, Jerusalem, the settlements, and territory, generally speaking. There's a lot of discussion in the academic literature and in the popular press about the Camp David meeting, which was presided over by Bill Clinton. But there's a lot of myths associated with that as well. One of the key myths is that Israel agreed to divide Jerusalem and share it with the Palestinians. Completely untrue, a complete lie. What was offered at that meeting by Ehud Barak was the renaming of a village outside of Jerusalem. That village is called Abu Dis. They would rename that village Al-Quds, which for Arabic speakers is the name that's commonly used for Jerusalem. Anyone who knows the place, and certainly anyone who lives there, knows that Abu Dis is not Jerusalem. And so Yasser Arafat rightly said, I can't go back to the Palestinian people and tell them that suddenly Abu Dis is Jerusalem. No one's going to believe that. Then they also said, well, the other myth is that Israel was willing to give up, most of the West Bank, 90% of the West Bank territory to the Palestinians. Completely untrue, because that didn't include what had already been settled by the Israeli settlers. So it didn't include the settlements, didn't include all the bypass roads, didn't include all the military checkpoints. So essentially, what was being offered there was about 16% of historical Palestine. Already the Palestinians were in a position, because you remember right back at the beginning of this lecture, when Israel declared its state, it was over 78% of historical Palestine. That essentially left the Palestinians with only 22% of their historical homeland. And now at Camp David, they were saying, well, you can maybe have 16% of your historical homeland. Completely unacceptable. I mean, 22% is outrageous, but now bringing it down to 16%, even more unviable. Then we come to the roadmap for peace. This is in 2003. But I want to point you to another very important resolution, a very important agreement that was made. This was by the Arab League in 2002. This is the Arab Peace Plan. And anyone who says the Arabs are not interested in peace and they're, the main problem here is wrong. Write it down and go on the internet and look up the Arab Peace Plan of 2002. It was signed in Beirut, in Lebanon. What the Arab League, which consists of 22 Arab nations, agreed to at that time was an end to the Israel-Palestine conflict based on the following provisions. Israel will withdraw from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and this will become a Palestinian state. In exchange, every Arab nation will have normalization of relations with Israel, including diplomatic and trade relations. So Israel in 2002 had an opportunity to have peace with the whole Arab world, and Israel rejected it. How did that come about? When George Bush Jr. was President of the United States, this is where the roadmap for peace began. And he was very excited when he heard about the Arab Peace Plan, and he said, good, sounds good to me, because that's the practice of the United States, jump on the back of another peace agreement that someone else has done. So he jumped on this and he said, I'm coming up with the roadmap for peace. It's going to be a phased process where by 2005 there will be an independent Palestinian state based on the withdrawal of Israeli forces and the withdrawing down of the occupation, and at the same time, Palestinians, disengaging with terrorist activity, blah, 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 right? But what was the first thing the Israelis said in response? Okay, subject to 14 exceptions, 14 points we want you to withdraw from that, including a reference to the Arab Peace Plan. We don't want any reference to that in the roadmap. And again, you don't need to come here today to hear this lecture to know that the roadmap for peace has been a complete failure. It was supposed to result in a Palestinian state by 2005. We're nearly in 2015, 10 years later, and we haven't seen it happen. So another complete failure, and it's very disturbing and disappointing that Barack Obama, in the time that he's been president, has continued to make reference to this, ridiculous plan that was, never going to result in a peaceful resolution if you don't hold both sides to account. Next one, thank you. So when I talk about the failure of the peace process, I'm talking about two fundamental flaws. The first one is the insistence on negotiations between two highly asymmetrical parties. Now that might sound controversial. You might be thinking, oh, negotiations must be a good thing. That must be the right way to go to resolve a conflict. Why is that such a problem? The problem is that Israel and Palestine are highly asymmetrical. All right? This means that they are not balanced in terms of their power and potential. Think about it like this. Israel is the most powerful military, has the most powerful military in the region, and probably one of the most powerful militaries in the world. It has an economy that completely subsumes the Palestinian economy. It's one of the strongest economies in the region. It's a recognised full member state of the United Nations, and so on and so forth. What about Palestine in comparison? Israel has tanks, helicopter gunships, missiles, nuclear weapons. What do the Palestinians have? Small arms, homemade rockets. Completely asymmetrical. They're not even. The Palestinian economy is completely controlled by Israel. Nothing can move in or out of Palestinian territories without going through Israel. Even the tax that is collected by Israel, and when Israel feels like it, it passes that on to the Palestinians so that they can pay for their public servants and the running of their territories. So completely controlled by Israel. And as far as political potential goes, it's only in 2012 that we see the recognition of a Palestinian state. Prior to that, only observer status with the United Nations and not regarded as a state internationally. Also, the other problem is a lack of reference to international law. If you look at the Madrid, the Oslo, the roadmap, all of that, there was no reference to international law. And so we've never been able to reach what I refer to as a just peace. And what I mean by a just peace is peace based on people's rights rather than power. Any questions about that? Okay. Let's have a look at, for my PhD thesis and for my first book I wrote, the book's called Reconstructing Jihad Amid Competing International Norms. So this is the first book I wrote on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And in that, I did an analysis of all of the United Nations Security Council resolutions on Israel-Palestine. And in fact, there were about 60 at the time. There's some more that have been passed since then. Now, that was only Security Council resolutions. I mean, if I had have done UN General Assembly resolutions, there would have been many more. But I did Security Council resolutions because the United Nations Security Council is the international organ that is responsible for maintaining international peace and security. The decisions made by the Security Council constitute international law, and they are meant to be based on international law. And they come with an authority that General Assembly resolutions tend not to have as far as the international community is concerned. They tend to have more of a binding authority than the General Assembly resolutions. Now, looking at all of those resolutions that were passed between basically 1946, you could say, because there were a couple at that point, but essentially from 1947 all the way through to 2006, there were about 60 resolutions that I analysed. And I analysed them in relation to the so-called final status issues, or what is regarded as the major obstacles to peace: territory, settlements, Jerusalem, refugees. What you can see here is, in respect to territory, the United Nations Security Council has repeatedly invoked this provision, that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible. So if you think about it, one might say that, well, the United Nations General Assembly gave Israel, 55% of the historical Palestine, but there's another 23% that was acquired by force, which, according to international law, would make it inadmissible. And there's a bunch of resolutions that I've quoted here for you. In that pack that's been distributed, I've included one of the journal articles that I've previously written on this issue. And this is basically a summary of my analysis of the UN Security Council resolutions. And this was published in the Australian Journal of Peace Studies in 2009. As far as Jerusalem is concerned, all of these resolutions passed by the Security Council always regard Jerusalem as illegally occupied. Israel claims that Jerusalem is our capital, not according to the General Assembly and not according to the Security Council. In fact, the Security Council has directed all states not to establish their embassies in Jerusalem and not to recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. In very clear, unambiguous language. The Israeli presence in Jerusalem is regarded as illegal. There is no mention of this being administrative or in some way acceptable or authorised by the United Nations. It's always and only regarded as illegal. And Israel is repeatedly called on to desist from altering the demographic, the cultural and the legal status of Jerusalem. Everything Israel has done in Jerusalem is considered by the United Nations Security Council to be null and void and of no legal consequence. As far as the settlements are concerned, we can point specifically to 4 United Nations Security Council resolutions that say that those settlements are illegal and must be dismantled. Israel must immediately desist from building new settlements. And all states are called upon not to assist Israel in the building or the maintenance of those settlements. So in fact, the argument could be made that it is illegal under international law for countries to engage in activities such as buying products that are produced in those settlements. It's illegal to support the settlements in that way. And as far as the refugees are concerned, a lot of people say, well, the United Nations only started talking about Palestinian refugees from 1967 onwards. Not true. Resolutions 89 and 93 refer specifically to the Palestinians who were made refugees as a consequence of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine that began in 1947. So all the legal evidence is there to support what I refer to as a just peace, a peace based on people's rights, not based on power. So when you're discussing this issue with people, with politicians, I think it's worthwhile making reference to international law. And when they ask you what kind of peace are you talking about, a peace based on international resolutions and human rights. That's the answer. Here's a map of historical Palestine. And this is how it looks today. So historically, we can see this is before 1948, 100% of the territory in dark yellow there is what we historically referred to as Palestine. Moving on to the United Nations resolution to partition Palestine, we can see there the state of Palestine has been reduced to less than 48%. Moving on to 1967, the Six-Day War, when Israel defeated its Arab neighbours, specifically Egypt, Jordan and Syria. The Palestinian state is further reduced, leaving only the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But at this time, from 1967, they also come under the occupation of Israel. So essentially, by 1967, you have Israel in control of 100% of historical Palestine. And then we have the situation today. And this map's a couple of years old, so it probably looks worse than that right now. Even George Bush, when he was the President of the United States, said, when I look at the map, it looks like Swiss cheese. He also made a comment of the checkpoints, and he added to that I imagine it's a lot easier for me than it is for many of the local people. But have a look at this. Basically, you've got Gaza, a small territory of 360 square kilometres, and then you've got the West Bank. As George Bush rightly described, looks like Swiss cheese. So those white patches that you see within the West Bank are Israeli settlements. That big strip of white that you see to the west of the Jordan River is called the Jordan Valley. With the exception of Jericho, that yellow part that you see near just north of the Dead Sea, all of that territory has been depopulated. So basically, since 1967, Israel has had a sustained bombing campaign in the Jordan Valley to remove all Palestinian villages and populations from that territory. Essentially what they want is, if they ever have to accept a Palestinian state, that Palestinian state will have no borders with any other Arab country, which is why even in the Gaza Strip you have a buffer zone between Egypt and that Palestinian territory. You'll also notice the dark line that seems to be running around the West Bank. Now you'll notice that that dark line doesn't run along the border. That border is referred to as the 1949 Armistice Line. When the war ended in 1949, a line was drawn around the West Bank, and this is essentially where hostilities ended. And so that kind of defined what the West Bank had become. But you'll notice the wall doesn't run along the line of the Armistice Line, 1949 Armistice Line. It cuts deep into the West Bank, essentially annexing annexing the Israeli settlements from the Palestinian territories, making them part of Israel. If you were to drive on any of the roads between Israel and those settlements, you will notice, well, it's what you don't notice, in fact, that's more significant. You feel like you're still in part of Israel. The highways are connected. People don't realise they're going into occupied territory. They don't realise they're on a settlement here, because it all feels like it's part of Israel. And you don't see the Palestinians, you don't see the wall. It's designed in such a way as to absolve you of having to confront that reality. You have a major part of the wall built around Jerusalem, essentially annexing as much territory of Jerusalem as possible from the Palestinians. So essentially the question would be asked, what kind of state would the Palestinians have if this is what they ended up with? We're talking about here, 10 to 15% of historical Palestine. And a state that is not that's not just, it's not fair, and it's not even viable. Any questions about those maps? Or any questions about the territory? Okay. Now, what's been happening around the world is that over the last 10 years, there's been a swing against Israel because of its policies and practices. And we can look at poll data from the BBC and from a range of other organisations that have clearly shown a high degree of negativity towards Israel all around the world, perhaps with the exception of the United States, which tends to have some elements of negativity, but not as overwhelming as the rest of the world. I mean, for example, the latest BBC World Service poll has again shown, and this has been the same for years, that Israel is one of the most negatively viewed nations in the world, just ahead of, it's in fact in fourth last place, just ahead of Iran, North Korea and Pakistan. That's the kind of company that the state of Israel keeps today. And this has been the case for many years. As far as Israel, the Israel-Palestine conflict is concerned in the Australian context, I did a study in 2010 where we did a national survey of Australian public opinion on the Israel-Palestine conflict. That's published in a journal article in the Australian Journal of Political Science and also in a book that I wrote called Making Australian Foreign Policy on Israel-Palestine. But what we found through that survey is that over 90% of Australians see resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict as important for world peace. So it is an important issue for Australians. The majority of Australians identify with the Palestinian perspective of the conflict. In fact, 55% view the conflict as Palestinians trying to form their own independent state. Only 32% accept the Israeli version or the Israeli narrative and see it as a conflict of Israel trying to defend itself against Palestinian terrorism. 92% of Australians support the right of return of Palestinian refugees. 78% think that Israel should withdraw from the settlements. And the majority want Jerusalem to be a shared capital between Israel and the state of Palestine. And the majority want a resolution based on human rights and international law. That's what the Australian public has said. So if we think about, convincing the wider population, the majority of Australians are already there. They already identify with the Palestinian cause, with the Palestinian issue. It's politicians, I think, that need the convincing still. Let's talk about the state of Palestine that was declared in 2012. Just to go back a little bit, it's important to note that, and one of the things I did for my book on making Australian foreign policy on Israel-Palestine is to look at all the historical records on what various Australian governments have said about this conflict. And what we found was that since the 1970s, Australia has expressed support for an independent Palestinian homeland or state. That's very clear in the political statements that have been made, in the policy documents, etc. But in 2011, Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard expressed that Australia would not vote in favour of Palestine becoming a UN member state. And previously, Australia voted against Palestine becoming a member of UNESCO. Australia voted against Palestine becoming a member state of UNESCO. And on the 29th of November 2012, the United Nations General Assembly voted in favour of recognising the state of Palestine as a non-member observer state. What this means is that the Palestinian state doesn't have doesn't have full voting rights in the United Nations, but what it does mean is that the United Nations is recognising it as an official state, and that's the key point of this resolution. 138 nations voted for the resolution or in favour of the resolution. That's resolution 6719, and only 9 nations, including the United States and Israel, voted against it. Australia was among the 41 nations that abstained from that resolution. Now there's a controversial background that comes with this, this particular event, and that is that the Australian government wanted to vote, or Julia Gillard to be more precise, when she was Prime Minister, wanted to vote against that resolution. And it was very clear that she was influenced by the pro-Israel lobby in Australia. But with the exception of only 2 of her ministers, the rest of the government wanted Australia to at least abstain, and there was that was the right faction wanted Australia to abstain, and the left faction wanted Australia to vote in favour of that resolution. One of Australia's previous foreign ministers, Gareth Evans, in fact spoke to the Labor Party and said, if you vote against this resolution, you will end up on the wrong side of history. And other members of the Australian government made the point that, you know, they have people within their constituencies who want them to vote in favour of this resolution, and they risk losing the next election if they don't vote in favour of this resolution. So people power does matter still in Australia. If you contact your local representative and make your demands clear, it can have that kind of result. And so what ended up happening was, and this was published in the Sydney Morning Herald, that there was a Labor revolt against Julia Gillard, and even her leadership within the party was threatened if she didn't at least abstain on this resolution. And this is why Australia abstained, in spite of the fact that Gillard herself wanted to vote against that resolution. Now we come to UN General Assembly Resolution 6719, and I would regard this as perhaps one of the most significant events in the history of the Palestine struggle for self-determination, or for their own independent state. This document affirms Palestinian rights. It legitimises the Palestinian state, consisting of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And this is a very important point. And when we talk about East and West Jerusalem, anyone who's ever been there knows West Jerusalem is not the real Jerusalem. When you think of Jerusalem, I'm sure you're thinking about, you know, the old city, you know, and the holy sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock. All of this is in East Jerusalem. West Jerusalem is a new part. So if the Israelis want to have West Jerusalem, you know, so be it. The part that the Palestinians are concerned about is East Jerusalem, and that's what is affirmed in this resolution. This document articulates the principles of international law relevant to the Palestinian case. So those various resolutions that I mentioned, they're spoken about and they're referenced here in this resolution. The document is framed in respect to specific UN resolutions central to resolving the conflict. So it's essentially an endorsement of international law and the human rights perspective. And it identifies Palestinian refugees, Jerusalem, settlements, borders, security and water as the core issues that must be resolved in order to achieve a just, lasting and comprehensive peace between Israel and Palestine. So it's a very important document to refer to if you're engaging in discussions about this issue. Any questions before we move on to this last part of the presentation today? Okay, I hope it wasn't information overload, but it's been going on for 100 years, so there's a lot of important points to touch upon, and I've tried my best to give those matters due attention. But if you don't have any further questions at this point, I'd like to talk for a moment about activism. I have mentioned that if we look around the world, the majority of the population in most countries have now started to identify with the Palestinians. They're sympathetic towards the Palestinian cause, and there's a high degree of negativity towards Israel because of its policies and practices towards the Palestinians. And right now, the bombing campaign that Israel is engaged in against the Palestinians in Gaza is doing it no favours at all. And we have, a string of incidents that have cast Israel in a negative light, or have shown Israel for the kind of state that it is. What's important here in terms of engagement is to engage political representatives. I believe that the public is on side. A majority of the public identify with the Palestinians, but I think it's politicians that need convincing. So it's important to write letters to your politicians, and in those letters they need to be asked questions, very specific questions about do you accept international law and human rights as a basis for resolving this conflict? Ask them specific questions like that. Do you accept the right of return of Palestinian refugees? Do you support the dismantling of Israeli settlements? Do you support Jerusalem to be a shared capital? Those kinds of questions, and perhaps there are others that you can come up with yourself. Do you support Palestinian children being held in Israeli prisons and tortured in those prisons, as was reported by Four Corners right here in Australia? Ask them those kinds of questions. And then tell them that the response you give me is going to be put on Facebook, it's going to be put on social media so people can know what your views are on this. You can't hide from these views. You can't tell me one thing and then say something else to somebody, to the next person that speaks to you. You have to be consistent with your views and demand that they take your views to the Foreign Minister and to the Prime Minister of this country. They're your elected representative. They should take your concerns forward. That's their job. So unless people put pressure on them and ask them these hard questions, they've got it easy. Why should it be easy? Challenge them and have those views put on record. Make an open letter and tell them that your responses are going to be put on Facebook. And if they don't respond, tell them, I wrote to this person, this is what they asked them, and they didn't even have the decency to respond. That's going to look bad for them. Framing the issue is very important. Now, I was at the rally last weekend, and some of you, some people who, said that they wanted to come to this presentation today questioned, why is it on at the same time as the rally? I've had mixed feelings about rallies over the last, few years. I see them as being somewhat counterproductive, and they are counterproductive depending on who you get there. And last week was very disappointing. We had people coming along and shouting out, Allahu Akbar, Takbir, Allahu Akbar. What does that do? That completely alienates a large proportion of those people who are present at this conflict. Is this a Muslim issue or is this a human rights issue? That's the question. And if you're shouting out Takbir and Allahu Akbar and so on, you've just alienated a bunch of people who you need on your side. And you just undermined that argument that this is a human rights issue. And you've told everybody this is a Muslim issue, and it's not. So that kind of language is completely inappropriate. Burning things at a rally is completely inappropriate. Why? Fortunately, the media weren't there last weekend, but if they were, what would have made it onto the 6 o'clock news? The precise argument about why this is wrong, why this is a violation of human rights? No, that would not have made it on the news. It would have been a clip of the burning, and that would have been it. And so it's just more hostility, hot air, frustration, insignificance. So you have to make people focus on the key issue here. Don't get distracted with slogans and this other nonsense. Be clear about what this issue is. This issue is about human rights and international law. And it's about governments being held to account because they subscribe to organisations like the United Nations. And when the United Nations pass resolutions, they should accept those resolutions and do their utmost to implement them. So again, it's not an Arab or a Muslim issue. This is a human rights issue. And at a time when you have most of the world on side here, don't undermine that by coming out and alienating most of that population and making it into something that it is not. It is not an Arab and Muslim issue, it's a human rights issue. Just as apartheid in South Africa was a human rights issue that the world got behind, this too is a human rights issue that the world is getting behind, so don't alienate people. And you know, one of the toughest aspects of this battle is standing up against people within Arab and Muslim communities. Often they're as big a problem as, you know, what the Israeli lobby is doing. And so a tough part of this is standing up and addressing those people and, you know, telling them that their approach is wrong. This has to be framed in terms of human rights and international law because ultimately that's what it's about. And the approach, again, you know, ask tough questions and demand answers to them. And when they give you a response that is politicians, challenge that response if it's not adequate. If it's not consistent with international law and human rights, challenge them. So I think that's all I have. Oh, I got a bit fired up there at the end. Yeah. So, I don't want you to leave today wondering why, what, how, you know, ask those questions now, but I've got some business cards here. So if you want to email me, you know, you're welcome to send me an email and I hope to answer anything that you may have. If you were thinking about, you know, drafting a letter and you'd like some advice, you know, I'm happy to provide that support if I can. I can actually, so yeah, yeah. Yes?
Where do Labor stand now? Because they seem very quiet.
Yeah. Look, it seems as though there is still too much pressure from the Israel lobby on both sides of politics. And so, you know, the kind of response you'll get from Labor politicians is that, oh, we support a two-state solution, you know, and in respect to the recent conflict, we support a ceasefire. Look, at the end of the day, what is a ceasefire going to do? Sure, it'll stem the flow of death, but the suffering of Palestinians is not going to end with a ceasefire. We have to hold people to account to a meaningful resolution of this conflict, and a meaningful resolution means an end to Israel's occupation. Israel continues, and this is what they've done throughout this conflict, to raise the bar. And so as to distract those people who are the transnational Palestinian and human rights advocacy networks, distract them from the real goal. And so the building of the wall, you have movements now that are just dedicated to bringing down the wall. If the wall fell down tomorrow, would that solve the problem? No. This doesn't end until the occupation ends and the Palestinians have a state of their own that is just, fair and viable. And we have to call for the maximum. We can't be distracted by these issues that Israel, these little blockades that Israel has put in place. You know, an end to the blockade of Gaza would be excellent, and that would alleviate a lot of the suffering of the people of Gaza. But it's not going to resolve the problem. It doesn't end until the Palestinians have a viable, just, free state of their own. And we have to call for the maximum always. And so you will get from Labor politicians, you know, this rhetoric about supporting a two-state solution, you know, an end to the... I don't think you'll get an end to the blockade, maybe from some, and you'll get a ceasefire. Don't accept that. You know, don't accept that at all. Tell them that I've seen the maps, a two-state solution is not viable. You know, there has to be an end to the occupation, and at a minimum, the Palestinians should have 22% of their historical homeland as, you know, as their state, at a minimum. And even that's not fair. But the Palestinians in 1988 did make that concession when Yasser Arafat was the leader. And so if that's what Palestinians are happy with, that's what they accept. And I've been there, and Palestinians, to my surprise, said that they would be happy with that. So if that's their decision, and if that's what they support, then you know, we should lend our support for that as well. Even though I think that, you know, anything less than 50% wouldn't be fair. But you know, if that's what they've accepted, then fine. So we need to challenge the you know, those kinds of responses we get. Yes, Ismail. That's a really good question. You know, look, as far as news sources go, Al Jazeera is very good. Al Jazeera will often cover issues that you don't find on BBC, for example, but I also think BBC is good. So they're the two main sources that I refer to on a daily basis on a whole range of different issues. I would also add particular websites like Electronic Intifada is a good one to visit because they have news specifically on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Electronic Intifada. I know many of you wish you brought pens today, right? But you have a phone, like just type it in. Electronic Intifada, that's specifically on Palestinian. I mean, just subscribe to their thing and their thing will appear on your Facebook feed. The other one I would recommend, if you want an Israeli source, a reliable Israeli source, is Bet Salem. Bet Salem is an Israeli human rights organisation based in Jerusalem. I've visited the organisation and I've followed their reports over the years, and they are very fair to the Palestinian people. BT Salem, S-E-L-E-M. Yeah, Bet Salem. So just get their reports. And that way you can say to the politician with whom you're engaging, you know, this is not from a Palestinian source, this is from an Israeli human rights source, and this is what they have said is happening to the Palestinians. Look, most of the reports they produce is about the suffering of the Palestinians. They're a very important source to use. So I would say those two in particular, Electronic Intifada and Bet Salem, are good sources. It's mainly economic. Look, the long answer for you is to read this book by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, The Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy. It's quite a thick book. If you're not up for that challenge, they did write an article that was published in the London Review of Books by the same title that came out in 2006. This gives you a snapshot. These guys, John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, are from the University of Chicago and Harvard University, respectively. They're political scientists. They were previously, you know, what you might call conservative, you know, scholars. But they've taken a good hard look at US policy in relation to Israel, and they've written this book on that basis. It's a must read, I think. Now, another very important point here is, you know, we think about, you know, we live in a democracy. And so we assume that that means that we can go to our political representatives and we can have our voice heard. That might still be the case in Australia, fortunately for us. But there's been a study that came out just earlier this year. I was in the United States at the time, and it was all over the various news channels. And this was a study done by a group of scholars about to what extent is America still democratic. And what they found was that as far as the individual is concerned, their voice and their concerns account quantitatively account for zero. They have zero influence in the United States. It's only a very small percentage of wealthy individuals and groups in the United States that actually have any influence over the political process. So that's why, that kind of answers your question about why it's so difficult to get a political movement, you know, on this issue in a country like the United States. But I think there are opportunities still here in Australia. Fortunately, we've got organisations like Islamic Relief, who are on the ground in places like Gaza, who are able to provide that aid directly to Palestinian people. There are only a few organisations like that are recognised in Australia, and Islamic Relief is one of them, and it's the only Islamic organisation, I believe, that has that kind of status with the Australian government. It has credibility. So to treat the symptoms, you know, that is the day-to-day suffering of the Palestinian people, an organisation like that has to be supported. But it can't end there. We have to also treat the causes. And so organisations like the one Nora mentioned, APAN, employ people, and they only have a budget to employ 1 or 2 people to go and lobby government representatives. So to go and meet with politicians and state the case of the Palestinian people, you know, on their behalf. And you know, that's someone's full-time job, and that person is an expert that needs to be paid to do that work. You know, so they need the money from us to be able to continue to do that work. And that work does make a difference. If you think about it by comparison, the Israel lobby has many people in that same position, you know, going and meeting politicians every single day to make their case. You know, so to have 1 or 2 from the Palestinian side, you know, is necessary. At least that many is necessary. So that needs our support as well. So we need to address the symptoms, and we also need to address the causes of this conflict. Yeah. Look, there are websites dedicated to this issue of boycott, sanction and divestment that are a lot more fine-grained in terms of, you know, which companies should be boycotted, and they categorise them. And, you know, I think that, you know, it's probably wise to focus on those that are direct violators of international law and are direct supporters of the State of Israel, are direct supporters of the settlements, for example. And I think that it needs to be done in a more targeted way. But those organisations do make those distinctions between those that are directly violating the rights of the Palestinians and directly undermining the cause for peace, and those that are more at the periphery. Yes. If you Google BDS, boycott, sanctions and divestment, you'll be able to see. It's an international, you know, movement basically. Yeah, it's big. Yeah. So this leads to another very important point that I think needs to be acknowledged and mentioned, you know, in conversations you probably have with other people, and that is, you know, a lot of talk about terrorist organisations, and most regularly you'll hear about Hamas and Hezbollah. Let's think about this. They're discussed in a way as though these are terrorist groups that have been implanted into Palestinian and Lebanese territory respectively. But the point is that these are Palestinian and Lebanese people. And these groups emerged in response to what? These groups emerged in response to illegal military occupations that the United Nations has been unsuccessful in resolving. That is why people resist. The United Nations General Assembly has passed resolutions where they give the right to people to resist foreign occupation. And so, you know, the emergence of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah are a product of occupation. It will happen to all human beings anywhere on the planet. If you occupy a people, I'm sure it would happen here in Australia or anywhere else in the Western world as well. If you occupy a people, they will resist. They will fight for their rights, they will fight for their independence. That's what human beings do. So let's not be distracted by this label, Hamas, Hezbollah, and this and that. Let's take it back to the human level. This is how human beings respond when they are treated in this way. The only reason why these groups emerged in the Middle East is because of Israeli occupation. So if you want to end terrorism in the Middle East, in the context of Israel-Palestine, you need to end Israel's occupation. Full stop. Well, I think that might be a good point to end on. Yes.